welcome Alan. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to do a brief intro so we know Alan's background, and then Alan and I are going to have basically a conversation around the finance function of the future, and of course we're going to be hoping for some questions and comments from the audience in the room. Just something for my fellow CDAF executives, I'm having trouble seeing the chat function on how my screens are set up. So would someone be able to help me out with chat questions, if that's okay? Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Alan. Alan is Managing Director of Nelson Crew and founded accountingcpd.net a number of years ago. If you haven't heard of accountingcpd.net, it's a leading provider of online CPD for accountants and finance professionals, and actually Accounting CPD partners with a lot of professional bodies all over the world. So Alan's really got a finger on the pulse of what the professional bodies are up to, what their members are interested in, and also engages with business. Alan also has chaired ICAW's Practice Assurance Committee for a number of years and is, I believe, still currently a member of ACCA's SME Committee. So bringing that perspective as well from the smaller and owner-managed business point of view. And what we're going to be talking about this morning, Alan has recently written a report outlining his views on the accounting and finance function of the future, and we thought this would be a really interesting thing to talk about this morning. So we've gone through 2 years of COVID. We don't really want to look back to that too much, but perhaps there are some lessons to be learned about how this has perhaps shaped the finance function of the future. So welcome to Alan. Alan, do you want to add anything to your biography?
No, I'm flattered that you know so much about me. I think technically I may still be a member of ACCA's SME Committee, but about 5 years ago they stopped meeting. So I think I may be defunct now. They haven't been very clear about that, but so that's the only bit that I'd change. But yeah, some of you, I think this is all probably too long ago for anybody to remember. But the bit of kind of ancient history of my life was that I used to run Thomson Learning, the textbook publisher, and so was responsible for such gems as Collinger's Management of Cost Accounting. And I think Alan Thankster's speaking later, and he was involved with accounting education when we launched that. So I used to be much more connected with the academic world than I am now. But it's nice to be here, re-engaging.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's really great to get different perspectives this morning. We've already heard from Phil Fitzgerald from the FRC, from the Financial Reporting Lab, and we've had some good discussions there about his views on accounting professionals. So I'm going to start off with a question. And I know that you have a view that the finance function and the accounting profession is experiencing a period of quite rapid change. So when do you think this started, and what is driving this change at the moment?
You said that we probably don't want to spend too much time staring back at the pandemic, but you can't really avoid it on the question like this. I think we're all very aware of the fact that things have changed a lot over the last couple of years, and there's a temptation to think that of the period before that as a period of relative tranquility, but that's really not what we were thinking before COVID came along. Various think tanks and professional bodies, several different accounting professional bodies around the world were publishing reports about how we were going through a period of particularly rapid change. ACCA had published a report 2 or 3 years before that COVID broke out on the profession of the future, became known as the Accountant of the Future report, and they listed 4 drivers of change: digital technology, everything from cloud computing through AI, the ubiquity of data and the way it was changing the finance function's role and opportunity, increased regulation, increasing expectations of stakeholders, and I might talk about that later on, because I think the pandemic's changed that quite a lot as well, and globalization, which right now feels like we might be heading back a little in the opposite direction, but the trend seemed relentlessly towards globalization, and that was changing the way in which organizations of all size had to think about the way that they went about doing business.
Okay. And obviously COVID, as you mentioned, has had a very, very significant impact on everyone. And thinking a bit more specifically, of course, about accounting and finance professionals, how's the finance function been affected by particularly the events of the last 2 years?
Well, firstly, thinking back to when we first went into lockdown, it was obviously a massive shock to organizations, all sorts of different organizations of different sizes and in different sectors. And accountants played a pretty key role in the survival of those organizations that have survived, and the change that happened. So they played a really key role in just keeping things going, and that was strategic in terms of understanding business models and understanding the way and what had to happen and what didn't have to happen in order for organization to survive. But it was also tactical in terms of that they ended up inevitably being the people who were expected to understand the sources of government aid, and the various options available to organizations. So there was a kind of that they got taken, like I think people saw their value because they thought, wow, we might not be here if the accountants hadn't helped us right now. So that's useful for the professional, though in an unpleasant way. And then organizations kind of started sorting themselves out and moving towards a more, some idea of sustainable future and even success in some cases. Lots of mad ideas were thrown out. We could do this, we could do that. And I think the finance people played a pretty key role in validating and giving substance to those plans, weeding out the ideas that were really built on sand and validating those that had more substance. It struck me at the time that in a way, the process of making a big decision to change became easier. Making that change didn't become easier, but the change, because there were lots of things we had to do because we had no choice. If you were an online retailer and you would no doubt before the pandemic ever come along, you would have had some kind of online strategy and you would have an internal debate about how quickly you should progress with that. The people who ran the stores would be always arguing that any move online will cannibalize sales in the stores, and the techies will be arguing that that's the future and you can't hold back the tide coming in, as it were. And you debate that endlessly. If something happens that means you have to close all your shops, you haven't really got any choice but to try and trade online, and so you just get on with it. And I think quite a lot of organizations found that when the fog of the strategic debate was taken away, they were quite good at making things happen. And finance people played a really key role in that. And they made sure the cash was available to execute plans. They produced forecasts and budgets for things, and they made sure that things were done professionally. And then two other things. One is just the accountants' access to data was really important. It made sure that bad decisions were minimized and good decisions were identified, and it became the finance team's source of credibility. Their voice in the discussion was based on evidence, not just another opinion, and I think that gave them, as I say, gave them substance. And finally, we've been talking for years about how it would be good if accountants could spend more of their time looking forwards and less of their time looking backwards. But we'd inevitably spend half the month reporting on the one that's just happened and producing the various, that we'd get drawn into that. We haven't got any choice. But there's really not very much point in reporting on what happened in the last quarter if it's not entirely clear there is going to be a next quarter. So there was a moment at the beginning of lockdown where people really did just think, what are we going to do? Not what have we just done? And I think that pulled people's heads up and made them look forwards, and that creates an opportunity that it'll be easy to get drawn back into reporting on periods gone by. But if we can avoid that and spend more time looking forwards, it would be good.
So what do you think all this means for now looking forward? So for example, our students and the graduates that we are preparing for the world of work, what are your views on the future of the finance function and the accounting profession?
That's a big question. Firstly, it's really struck me that when times change, the people who understand the business model can help to answer the really hard questions. And when things stay the same, quite a lot of people appear to be pretty competent, but some of them are less able to cope when things change, and you realize that actually they just understood what happened. They didn't understand why. It's because somebody said this in the debrief of the, if you can get students to understand, somebody mentioned that if you can get students to understand why they're doing the transactions they're doing and not just which transaction is the right transaction, they're much more likely to be able to make good decisions. Well, the same is true in business, that the people who understand the dynamics of the business model can react to shocks to it, because they think, oh, they immediately think, oh, if that's changed, then obviously we'll have to change this over here. Whereas other people think, oh, but I normally do this, and they haven't got anywhere to go other than that. So I think understanding the business model is going to be seen to be more important, and should always have been right at the center of how we add value to the organizations that we work in. Secondly, I think people are understandably more interested and concerned with the concept of resilience. Lots of organizations went to the wall. Some really suffered bad consequences from the pandemic, and so conversations about sustainability and resilience are much more likely to get taken seriously and be given senior time than they would have been before. So that can mean deeper relationships with stakeholders, both financial and non-financial. It could mean greater understanding of supply chains and sales chains, and thinking about how we work with those in partnership with those organizations. It can be communicating with communities more than just the financial communities, and it can be creating more sustainable and resilient business models. I think also these kind of come out of the things that I mentioned earlier, that accountants have developed a voice in the strategic debate through that experience of ideas coming up and then validating some and not others, and so this is a massive generalization, but I think instead of the role being the rest of the senior management team decide what the strategy ought to be, and then you give it substance by creating forecasts and budgets and all that, the accountant is more likely to be accepted at that table at the beginning of the strategic conversation, and that's a real opportunity. And that's they can exercise that through their understanding of the business model and the strategies that should be adopted. They can contribute to the debate through their access to data and their ability to validate things, and they can contribute to the strategic debate through the application of the old skill. You know, I'm always on this hoggy horse that accountants should have more professional skepticism, by asking why and how do we know, and all those things that we tend to associate with auditors, but should be the preserve of every finance professional. That's how they have a role there. And finally, not to go on about this one at length, but if we can not lose sight of this extra time we can spend looking forwards and not backwards, it would be great, and not get drawn into back into the old ways of working. So looking to the next period seems to me more important than explaining the last period, and you can't get away with not explaining or accounting for the previous period. You've got to do that, but we do spend too much of our time producing reports that it's not clear that people need, or maybe they needed 2 years ago and no one's read it very recently. And month end is a bit of a drudge, and tends to just happen the same every month. So clear away unnecessary reporting and look forwards rather than backwards.
I think that's really interesting, and I think also there are some themes there that our first speaker Phil talked about, especially this idea of the accounting function being almost at the heart of the business model, and the accountant being in this very important strategic position to get involved with these big decisions in the organization, as you said, not just being the person to kind of make it happen or monitor what's happening, but actually being really the heart of that. And maybe linked to that, and I know you've touched on this just a little bit before, but what do you think are the most important skills that perhaps as educators in higher education we can try to impart in our graduate students? I think a lot of us are working very hard at the moment to think about how to build skills and competencies into our curricula, but we're not always sure what those are. So from your perspective, what do you think are really important for graduates at the moment?
I don't know how easy it is to build this into the curriculum, but for me, there's a whole bunch of non-technical skills that are what prepares you for a successful career in finance. And post-professional qualification, we're not very good at focusing on those. If you are a 25, 26-year-old who's completed their, actually that's a bit young, but to bear with me, completed their professional exam and are in their first qualified job, you're likely to get taken seriously or noticed if you do something technical that's clever. So if you spot something wrong that one of the senior people has prepared, if you could see, oh, surely that number's not right, because it can't be. The people will look at that person and think, oh, they seem pretty smart. They're welcome to be on the team, and you kind of get that validation from your technical ability, but you don't move into a position of finance leadership because you're the best. You understand IFRS better than anybody else. You need to have a basic level of competence, but that isn't why you get promoted. You get promoted because you have great emotional intelligence and you're good at working with people and communicating, and you have good judgment. You understand the business models, you have business acumen, all of those sorts of things. And we don't spend any time training people after their professional qualification on that. We don't spend enough time on that. And I think that's a shame, because it's the time where they've been most open to receiving those messages. I think when you're, between 25 and 35, if somebody starts talking to you about the way you work with other people and your emotional intelligence, you might be quite receptive to that. By the time you're 50, you're not going to, you've been, the die is cast a bit on those issues, and you might still learn lots of new, interesting techniques, but you're not going to change the whole way you operate. So I think some people reach a ceiling and are frustrated because they have no idea why they haven't been invited to sit at the next table, as it were. I think it's to do with those skills, and we're not helping them enough. Now, whether that can be addressed, I know you do on a lot of undergraduate programs, you do a lot of group work, and you try and develop skills so that people could get better at working in teams and that kind of stuff. And that's all great. But there's a whole bunch of stuff there that doesn't seem, if the students don't like some of the things that were referred to earlier, then I think a module on emotional intelligence is going to go down like a bucket of sick, I would think. But it would be great. But of course, it's a practical thing that you really want people to develop habits and behaviours rather than just learn facts. And that's not going to be popular with a student population that wants to know how to pass the exam.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't know the answer to this, but I guess a lot of us have employability either as a separate module maybe, or we certainly try to embed employability and whatever that means into our curricula. And I think it would be quite interesting maybe to either open it out to the audience now or later on, but how well those modules do go down with students, because you obviously imply that maybe students wouldn't like a module on emotional intelligence, and I don't know the answer. I think they might be quite receptive to things like that if they think it would help them to get a good job when they graduate. But that's just my observation, and maybe we can come to that later on. And perhaps I've just got one other kind of question, which is more focused a little bit on specific skills that perhaps we could try to impart into our students. Do you think that students need to know other disciplines that are related to accounting, so things like programming and coding and systems planning? Do you think that accounting education for us in HE should move away from the technical and more towards this kind of interdisciplinary angle? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think data analytics is incredibly important, and it is both an opportunity and a threat to young people's future careers. I've got an example right now that's entirely relevant to that. We have a massive amount of data that is the accumulated tracking records of everybody who uses any of our learning resources, which is potentially fantastically valuable for us in understanding what their actual behaviours are, rather than we ask them a lot of questions about what they'd like, but that's different to what they actually do. And so there's a great resource there that we could mine to improve the quality of what we do. Now, I'd love to put an accountant on that. I'd love to put an accountant on analysing that type of data and coming up with proposals and costing things and thinking, working out what the value of different things potential value might be and how much they would cost to deliver. And if I could find one who had the data analytics skills and could pull the data out of a SQL database, then I would, which probably means a bit of SQL knowledge and maybe basic knowledge of Power BI, then I'd rather employ them. But if I can't, I'm not going to employ an accountant who can't do that. I'll employ a very bright data management graduate who's got the programming and statistics skills. And so there's a direct position there that there's a job. And the irony that, I was talking about earlier about the ACCA report about the future of the profession. And at that time, I remember everyone was predicting that the rise of digital technology would threaten a large number of jobs in the finance sector, and that a lot of people would find themselves unable to carry on because so many tasks would be automated. We come out of the pandemic and we find there's a massive shortage of accountants, and that's not where we seem to be headed at the moment. But I do think there are great opportunities for accountants to add value to the organisation. But if they don't take them, somebody else will do them, and they won't be accountants, and that seems a shame, because it's an understanding and knowledge of the business and the finances of the business that would massively enrich that process. But not so much that if you can't do the analysis, I'm still going to ask you to do it.
Yeah, it's a good example, and I think our students are keen to learn things like data analytics and, as you mentioned, Power BI and those particular applications. I think the problem that a lot of us have in academia is we don't have the skills to teach them. And so we're perhaps reluctant to introduce this to our students just because of that reason. It's not because we don't want to, we maybe can't. So as I said before, I'm having a little difficulty seeing the chat. Could I maybe pass over to one of my CDAF colleagues who could maybe man the chat and run through that section for me?
Lisa, I'll do that.
Thanks, Darren.
Just let me know when you want to go through it. Do you want to go through it now?
Yes, yeah, please.
Yeah. So yeah, Graham, you had a point about the accountant and how loud their voice is to change the culture. Do you want to put that point to Alan?
Yes, it's just that a couple of years ago, sustainable and resilient meant profitable, generating short-term cash, and had suppliers lined up for when the existing suppliers went bust, or employees lined up when the current underpaid employees get a new job. And it strikes me that unless there is a cultural change in what sustainable and resilient means, we're going to be back to the way things were a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure that the voice of the accountant is a loud enough voice. Shareholder pressure is the same shareholder pressure.
That may be true in some organisations. I do think sustainable and resilient are being used in a very loose way. People are using those terms and not choosing to define whether they mean likely to be here next week or not doing damage to the environment. And obviously those things are interconnected, but they're quite different. And so that allows people to nod sagely and agree when maybe they don't. So yeah, I get that. I do think there's greater pressures than just people thinking they ought to do the right thing. I think the investor community is pretty big on this, and it's going to become difficult for organisations who don't have a pretty clean bill of health on particularly on climate related issues to attract major investment. And that trend is, I can't see that being reversed. So I think there is a fair headwind behind that stuff, but it kind of depends on different sectors, because I think that's less true, for instance, of the SME sector, where the pressure there could come from larger people in the supply chain who expect you to comply with things that you wouldn't otherwise have bothered with, or it may come from the owners and investors themselves who have a belief system that means they want to do that. But if that's the case, then there will be other people who don't share those beliefs, who don't. But of course, in terms of the scale, if the large organisations go there, that'll have a big impact on the overall shape of the economy, and they will pull along with them some of the smaller organisations through their insistence that they comply with those sorts of issues in the supply chain. So I'm not saying it's a game that's been won, but I think it's more than just the voice of the finance professional, and there are reference points they can use to say why things should be being done in a particular way, and why the organisation should take a broader view.
Thanks, Alan. Is that okay, Graham?
It is. And just, Alan, on that, in the world of CPD, are you doing anything on environmental reporting, on trying to change financial reporting to start pricing externalities into the financial reporting? Is that part of your suite of programs?
Yeah, we've been let me be quite specific about what we're doing here, because actually it can be, it probably makes it a more interesting answer. We have a service that we provide which gives a weekly commentary on the news from an accountant's perspective, picks up news stories and explains what the accounting point is. And we've written, they call them news bites, and we've written news bites on the they don't call them exposure drafts when it's the sustainability accounting boards, do they? I can't remember what they call them, but they've issued the first two statements of intent, and I seem to be moving, because we also raised our eyebrows when the sustainability standards board was first set up, because we thought there needs to be really rapid action here, and I'm not sure the IFRS the process of releasing IFRS standards is so long-winded that I just thought we'll all be dead by the time they've managed to come up with some standards we have to follow. That doesn't seem to be a good process, but to be fair to them, they seem to have acted quite quickly and got on with that. So we've been commenting on that kind of stuff. I commissioned a course a month or so ago called Accounting for Carbon, which is more of a management accounting take on how we can look at an organization's carbon footprint and measure and manage it over time. And as the standards get released, we will produce CPD material on those. As a counterweight to that, because as you may gather, we're pushing that agenda, and generally we also commissioned a course actually last week called Accounting for a Better World, which is about anti-corruption, it's about fraud, and it's about climate change and all those kinds of things. It's about the positive role that accountants can have. And some of those things are somewhat hopeful in terms of whether we'll get people to engage. As a counterpoint to that, I can tell you that we recently did a survey of users. We had about 1,100 responses. And one of the questions we asked them was to rank different topics in terms of how important they thought they were for the next year's CPD. And I can tell you somewhat depressingly, the top of the list were financial reporting and Excel skills, and bottom of the list was sustainability. So, out there at the coalface, I'm not sure that we're getting it yet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Alan, I had a question myself, which was to link into the professional bodies. I think in academia, we would all love the opportunity to explore topics that you've been talking about. And for me, something like scenario planning seems like a fairly obvious topic that should be given more room in the syllabus. But I wondered to what extent you think the professional bodies should really lead on this, because at undergraduate level in particular, a lot of universities, including my own, are really constrained by having to use exemptions as a marketing ploy to attract students. And that to a certain extent restricts us to the curriculum or syllabus of the professional bodies. And whether really the role of the professional bodies should be more visible in this.
I'm probably massively out of date on this, but when I was last engaged with that as a question, my observation was always there seemed to be an awful lot of hoops to jump through and not very many exemptions the students get when they complete. You still have to do most of the training contract and most of the exams, and it seems to be quite a lot that's expected of you in terms of your curriculum in order to deliver that benefit. But I do get that unless you can say, look, it's accredited, you're not going to get students coming through the door. So that's a massive challenge. But I think, and I don't know how you organise this, but some kind of bigger pushback on it seems to me that the benefit of an accounting and finance degree is sold short if it's just super accreditation. That you'd be better off doing something else. I know you're not the right audience to say this to, but somebody said earlier we weren't here to be liked. But you don't get enough benefit for it. You could do something else and then professionally qualify afterwards. It wouldn't take you very much longer. And so the benefit has to be more than just getting accreditations. It has to be about being better at the judgment issues and at being a great finance professional, not just knowing quite a lot of the stuff already, so the professional exams are easy. But at 18, would students get that? I don't know. I'm not involved in marketing. Sarah's shaking her head.
Yeah, I think a lot of us would agree with your sentiment there, Alan. The reality, I guess, that many of us face is that students now consider themselves as consumers, and so they want something tangible or almost tangible to make their decision on. And I think for many students, that's become the tangible peg in which they hang their hat when choosing a course. And I guess what I was really getting to was, and I think Tim might have something to say on this, Tim, given the research you were doing, that if we are moving to this area where scenario planning and strategic thinking becomes a greater part of the finance function, certainly in industry, then does it need to be given more width in the professional curriculum?
I think we should look at this notion of universities just looking for exemptions, or if that's really what students want. I mean, I agree with Alan. You know, the benefit of an accounting degree has to be more than just exemptions from a professional qualification. And maybe we should think about how we could work in partnership. And the site of learning for different skills can be, if you look at the law profession, they now partner with certain universities which develop specific skills and competencies while the law assess different things. Maybe we should be looking at a more dynamic partnership than just textbook learning and seeking exemptions.
Yeah. I don't want to go too far down the exemptions debate, because that's a whole different
A bit of a rabbit hole,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah. So Sarah's put a question in the chat. Sarah, I know you're having a couple of problems with your system at the moment. Do you want to ask your question to Alan?
Yeah, but I'll go with the second one. I suppose is, how do we prepare our students for jobs that don't yet exist? You know, how do we? I mean, I'm not expecting you to necessarily have the answer for that, Alan, because if you did, you probably wouldn't be sitting doing what you're doing at the moment. You'd be doing something else, and equally, I would be as well. But I just wonder, you know, from your experience of seeing what our students or graduates come out with into the world of work, do you have any nuggets in terms of how do we preempt, you know, that change in the future that, you know, we've seen you know, exponentially grow in the last couple of years?
I know it sounds like a question that is kind of impossible to answer, but I don't think that it is that hard, actually. You don't know what the jobs are going to be, but you know some stuff about them. You know that if you develop people who really understand the financial side of a business, they're going to be useful in those jobs, whatever they are. And if they have good judgment, they'll be more valuable than if they don't. And if they understand the underlying principles of things, not just the surface level functional things that you do, they'll be more likely to be adaptable as they go forwards. So there's all of that stuff. There's a whole bunch of employability skills that we've talked a bit about that you know, they may not equip them to do the new jobs, but they'll certainly prevent them from doing them if they don't have them. And then there's the whole issue of data, which I think sits there the whole time, that if we don't make people more competent in that area, people who aren't from finance background are going to take some of the jobs. And so that's pretty critical. And again, we don't know what jobs are going to be created, but they're sure as hell going to be more likely to be staffed by people who have really strong technical skills in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, no, interesting answer. Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, Greg makes a point in answer to your question, Sarah, around, I guess, what we would recognise as historically we'd recognise them as academic skills: critical thinking, dealing with ambiguity and problems, creativity, flexibility. So I guess if you disagree, Greg, let me know, but giving them the toolbox to be able to deal with whatever the issue might be at hand is maybe the way to go.
It's also about the confidence and the ability to be able to, the confidence to do it and to be able to communicate it, I guess, work with people in a way that they can do those things productively. I think we're very bad at the learning to learn and the confidence thing. It's something which is very difficult, but it's something we need to work on more, I think.
It's difficult to
thanks,
it's difficult to position those things as in ways that students will think are hard-edged enough. But it is genuinely true that if you talk to general business managers, at times when things change, people with those skills are the ones they want around them, and you know, they really are important. And you don't, I keep saying this, but you don't turn to the person next to you and say, oh, I'll get your opinion on this because you're really brilliant on this arcane aspect of corporation tax, unless that's what you're asking them. You go to the people who have good judgment and have, as you say, critical skills, creativity, flexibility, problem solving, those kinds of things. They are what you want them in the room.
I guess following up on that, Alan, I did read your report.
That's unfortunate because it means you already know everything I've said today.
No, it was really interesting, and can I just say it was written in a really good layman's, down to earth, easy to read format, which was great. So I don't know whether that's a bit of advertising for you on your future reports, but it was really good plain text. It was great. I just wondered what, whether out of the skills and attributes that you identified, if you could give us a sort of, what would your top 3 be, that, using the old 80-20 rule, if we could concentrate on 20% of them to get 80% impact, what do you think that might be?
Well, you'll know what I said in the report if you've seen it, which was, there were 3 things in there, which were focus on strategy, understand business models, get close to stakeholders and that kind of stuff, and agree what your strategy is and how you're going to report against it. Focus on the future, not on the past. And I think that could affect the curriculum. A lot of curriculum is based on accounting for the performance in a particular period, and less of it, I think, and this is a generalization, I may be being unfair, less of it seems to be based on what was called scenario planning earlier, but all those types of things that finance people can be really positive about. And I guess, although I don't like saying it, in the report we said, make sure that you don't forget to manage the detail as well, because if you do mess that up, you tend to not get taken so seriously. But it's not the most exciting bit of it. But yeah, if I was just answering off the top of my head now, I'd probably knock on about data, and I'd knock on about what we used to call the skills that make someone into a T-shaped professional. Is that a thing that resonates with people? That there was some research that was done, or we were working with Engineers Ireland at the time, and they said when the engineers came out of their professional qualification, they were great. They were pretty good engineers, but they took them a couple of years to become people that were very employable because they'd never worked with other people, or there's a whole bunch of stuff that was like the top of a T that broadened them out as professionals. And I still quite like that as a visual image. It works quite well for me, but it is communication, presentation skills, emotional intelligence, resilience, all those kinds of things that we don't spend a lot of time on.
That's great. Thank you very much. Have we got any more questions? There's no more questions in the chat box. Has anybody got any more questions? Sarah?
I was just going to say, just to come back on Alan's point there about the emotional intelligence, etc. Yeah, we can teach we can teach the presentation skills. We can do that side of things. But a lot of the problems I think that we face is that the students don't want to do and don't think it's necessary. And we can harp on about the fact that, you need emotional intelligence and we're doing this exercise for whatever, but unless a student engages, and that's the issue at the minute, is the engagement of the students in the university sector, I think, is not as good as it has been in the past. And therefore, we're all reverting back to teaching the technical, perhaps, because we're trying to do all these other things and not getting anywhere with it, because it's just not, it's going, I think somebody's used the bag of sick analogy earlier. It's going down like that with students, and therefore perhaps path of least resistance. And again, for a lot of staff for whom teaching, Greg mentioned it earlier about, being liked, teaching, if you're going through the promotion ladder, you need to get certain teaching scores, and therefore you'll do things which you'll tick the boxes rather than perhaps making their students' brains hurt and make it not difficult, but make them think. And therefore we're in this, it's a really difficult position that we all want to do all of these things, but we're coming up often against a brick wall with our audience, which, as Darren has already said, they're consumers and they're picking and choosing what they want to do. And if there's a hard module, I'm not going to do that because somebody's making me think too hard, and that's not what I'm here for. But
thanks, Sarah. I think Claudia's got a question or a point. I'm not sure which. Claudia.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was listening to several of the things you've mentioned, and I feel that, the focus on the student as a client is an issue. The focus on thinking about how we should prepare them, and everything you've said really touched me. Like, I think we need to put some sense of purpose as well in what we do in life. So I think we should bring that to teaching. But share it with students, make them feel a sense of purpose as well. Because if they see that they have a role to play, because we listen a lot to accountants will save the world, for example. And sometimes I think, well, I'm curious about that because it must be true, but how can we, help accounting for a better world and all those topics which are very relevant right now that we face huge crises in many different ways. We are sensing those crises now in Europe, but those crises exist all over the world for a long time. And now we are reaching the critical stage where we have to do something globally together. So we need to prepare students to be open to that, to be open to engage with other communities, locally, broadly, and to engage in ways that will be win-win, like the focus not being just on profit, but also how that profit comes from, where it comes from, what originated, thinking all about, human rights and other topics. And in order for them to understand they are here with us, we are all together, and we will be part of whatever we will do in the future. So engagement and making them feel a sense of purpose. Okay, I am listened, I am, what I mean? So I'm relevant. So I think it would help us to get out of the technical scope and the difficulties we do have nowadays, because our students are really used to a very structured context in which to work, and they need to stretch beyond that. Just a thought.
Great, thanks, Claudia. I'm conscious we're just coming up towards time. Lisa, did you want to come back on and close?
Yeah.
Alan, unless there's anything that you want to add in response.
Not in response to that. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I would say, I made this point to Lisa when I spoke to her the other day, I don't really want you to get your curriculum entirely spot on, because there need to be some gaps for us to fill after people have finished